Tracy, are we good to start now?
Yes, feel free to start.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Clark, and I am happy to welcome you to How to Create a Safe and Accessible Workspace for Lawyers with Disabilities. So a little bit of background on the program first. True diversity in the workplace extends beyond race, gender, and sexual orientation. It's important to foster an environment where disabled people feel safe and supported. Additionally, federal and state law may require certain accommodations in education, testing, and the workplace to address those limitations caused by a person's disability. As of August 2022, 34.6% of people identify as people with a disability that are currently employed, whereas 37.6% identify as a person with a disability that make up both unemployed and employed persons. While the presence of individuals with disabilities among law school graduates is not precisely known, the National Association for Law Placement research from the class of 2020 suggests that about 4.5% of graduates self-identify as having a disability. Yet, according to the 2021 NALP Report on Diversity, only 1.22% of lawyers were identified as having a disability. What's causing this discrepancy in the statistics? Who's falling through the cracks and why? Why aren't more disabled people going to law school? Are law firms, law schools, and other employers in the legal marketplace doing enough to support disabled lawyers and law students? Disabilities should not be a career impediment nor a deterrent from implementing inclusive practices and policies. This program is designed to discuss various types of disabilities, including physical, emotional, mental, and neurodiverse abilities, and address how lawyers and employers can embrace furthering accessibility for their employees, co-counsel, and clients. Creating a safe and accessible workplace for lawyers with different abilities extends beyond complying with ADA requirements. Promoting a culture of inclusion, not only for those with visible physical disabilities, but also for those with invisible disabilities that can include neurodiverse lawyers, can create a stronger and more creative workplace that better represents clients and builds trust in the community. So thank you again for joining us today. Now I'm going to introduce our wonderful members of our panel today. So first we have Sarah Hoffman. Sarah is a 2021 Equal Justice Works Fellow at Disability Rights North Carolina, North Carolina's federally mandated protection and advocacy agency. Her self-designed project focuses on improving prison conditions for people with mental illness and other disabilities who are incarcerated in North Carolina prisons. Sarah's passion for disability rights began in college when she was diagnosed with bipolar I disorder and quickly accessed high-quality healthcare. She is dedicated to expanding access to high-quality behavioral health treatment, particularly for people involved in the criminal legal system who often lack agency over care. Sarah earned her law degree from the University of North Carolina School of Law, a Master of Public Policy from Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy in 2021, and she has worked with the National Disability Rights Network, the North Carolina Department of Behavioral Health, and the Mental Health Division of the Federal Public Defender Service, of the Public Defender Service for District of Columbia. Next, we have Hannah Kramer. Hannah Kramer received her bachelor's degree from Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas, and her law degree from St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. She practices disability rights law through TRLA's guardianship, education, and employment teams. Hannah manages TRLA's guardianship team and mental health legal project. She also serves as the ABA Young Lawyers Division Disability Rights Chair, ABA Young Lawyers Association Commission on Disability Rights Liaison, and State Bar of Texas Disability Rights and Issues Committee member. And finally, we have Christopher Palmier. Chris is an associate at the Simons firm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he lives with his husband and daughter. Prior to attending law school in his early 40s, he worked for a decade as a paralegal. After graduating and passing the bar, Chris drafted legislation for the state of New Mexico and clerked for the Honorable Jennifer Atrip in the New Mexico Court of Appeals before transitioning to private practice, where he focuses on probate administration, trust litigation, and estate planning. Chris has been visually impaired throughout his life with a visual acuity of 20/200, with a condition that is non-correctable with lenses. So special thank you to our panelists here with us today. And again, my name is Victoria Clark, and I am a member of the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion team with the ABA-YLD. So first, I'd like to start off by asking our speakers to briefly tell us a little bit about themselves and what inspired you to be here with us today. Why is the topic of creating safe and accessible workspaces for lawyers with disabilities important to you? And we will start with Chris.
Thanks, Victoria. Well, I think you covered my background pretty well in the bio, which I appreciate. Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting this. I think personally, obviously as a disabled attorney myself, and somebody who came to being an attorney later, and I think in part because of a lack of confidence, a lack of role models. I think that's why I feel it's important to keep this conversation going, and to keep addressing these issues in a public sphere and letting people know that, you know, this is something that they can do. Ultimately, I think that's what I'm here for, and to answer questions, talk about what it's like from my experience, and to hopefully, you know, move the conversation forward and try to address some of these disparities. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Hannah, same question.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm Hannah, like Victoria mentioned, and I have Crohn's disease, and at times with having Crohn's disease have had a medical device and appliance. So I identify as a lawyer with a disability. I think that this conversation is really important because, one, the legal profession is really hard. Nobody comes to us when they're having a really great day. People come to us when they're having a hard time and rely on us to make those hard times better. So to the extent that we can make the profession happier, comfortable, more safe and accessible for attorneys and people in the profession, I think is really important. We also know that diversity is really important in the workplace. And I think that when it comes to diversity, disability is often looked over. So I think that this conversation is important to talk about how we can make the workplace accessible for differently abled people. So we can have them at the table, we can have them in the profession, and we can make the profession welcoming and accessible for them.
Thank you. And Sarah, same question.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. And I think you gave a very thorough background, so thank you for that. Covered it, I'm Sarah. And I agree with what Christopher and Hannah said. The only thing I would add is that, you know, as attorneys, or people in any job, really, we spend a lot of our life at work, and having a workplace that we feel supported in, that supports our health, physical, mental, just overall well-being, is very important. And also talking about these types of issues, which are still very much stigmatized in many different environments. So I think even discussing them helps break down that stigma, helps people understand, gives them tools to maybe have these conversations with other people later on. And I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this discussion.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll go back to you, Hannah. Could you talk about invisible disabilities and how one with an invisible disability can advocate for themselves in their workplace?
Yeah. So I'm excited to talk about this because my disability is 100% invisible. I'm just a few weeks post-surgery, but you wouldn't know that by looking at me. And so the invisible illness conversation is really near and dear to my heart. And personally, for me, I think that I'm in favor of complete transparency. So what I've done in my workplace is I've been transparent with my supervising attorney and colleagues, co-counsel, paralegal, support staff, when I'm having a flare-up, when I have a procedure coming up. I've been transparent with them. And although the ADA doesn't require that, and I know that some people are not comfortable with that, for me, it's been really helpful. My colleagues have been really supportive when they've known what was going on. And I think that generally people will be supportive if they know what's going on, and it's just hard to be supportive if they don't know what's going on. And that's the hard part with an invisible illness. It's nice because I can hide behind it, but also if people don't know what's going on with me, then they can't support me, or they may think maybe I didn't respond to that email because I'm unreliable, when really it was just because I had a doctor appointment. So for me, I think transparency is really important, but I also would recognize that not everybody feels comfortable being transparent.
Thank you for sharing that. And speaking of transparency, Sarah, could you share any recommendations you might have as to what someone should do if they maybe feel a little uncomfortable with being transparent?
Yeah, I also am very transparent now, but I hid my diagnosis for a long time. I had a lot of internalized stigma and things. And I agree with Hannah. I think being open about it is helpful. I think building a support network, ideally, at least one person at your where you work, but also outside of work, who can be there for you and encourage you to take the steps that will help you. Also, Disability Rights North Carolina and other PNAs, and I'm sure other disability advocacy groups, have a lot of self-advocacy tools, including things like form letters for requesting accommodation, tips on how to prepare yourself to do that, things that can help you take those steps if you're feeling nervous about it, if you aren't sure whether that's a step you want to take. But I'm a true believer that people know what's best for themselves. So just surrounding yourself as best as you can with people who support you in those goals, I think is really helpful.
Thank you. And just real quickly, you mentioned, I think you said Disability Rights North Carolina and other PNAs. Could you tell us what PNAs are?
Yeah, sorry. It stands for Protection and Advocacy System. So every state has one of these under different federal laws related to disabilities. And it's the only organization where we provide free legal resources and advocacy to people with disabilities. And each one covers the whole state. And so there's lots of resources online that and you can just Google your state and then P and sign A, or you could go to Disability Rights North Carolina. Those resources really apply everywhere, but they often have these kinds of resources, or even can be sources of free advice if you're looking for more help.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I had no idea that that existed. So I'm sure people will find that helpful. So talking about resources, Chris, could you talk about some ways that employers can ensure that they're creating inclusive processes and procedures so that their differently abled employees are able to efficiently and effectively practice? What kind of resources should employers be providing?
That's a really good question, Victoria. Actually, it's not, I'm not a disability rights attorney like our other panelists here, and I'm sure that they would have a lot more detailed explanation of that. Actually, if you don't mind, if I could just jump back to the invisible versus visible question and transparency, and then I'll get right back to what you were asking me about just now. But because I wanted to just weigh in on that. In part, I want to take a step back and let people know that there is a difference between visible and invisible disability. And even though that may seem obvious to us, it might not be so obvious to some of our participants or people listening to this later. So right, in the sense of like when you have an interview, say for example, and you're in a wheelchair, if you roll up, obviously this is not something that you even have the choice of hiding, of disclosing or not disclosing. Though in the realm of Zoom, perhaps it is, right? So that puts people who maybe in wheelchairs or have other physical issues in a position that maybe they hadn't been in before. And I'd be very curious to hear from people who kind of have to navigate that now, because as somebody as well with an invisible disability, I have always been in a position where during the interview, I have to think about what am I going to say? Am I going to say anything? And how is it going to make me look in terms of trustworthiness, right? If I say that I'm visually impaired, that I'm legally blind, is that going to degrade the trust that somebody has in me, whether that's perceived trust or whether they even know it's happening? And I don't, there's no perfect answer to that, right? And I think that's what Hannah and Sarah were saying, is that it's a very personal choice. Yes, being out about it has its benefits, but also being strategic about it and choosing when to kind of disclose these issues also has its benefits. So yeah, I just wanted to weigh in about that. Now, in terms of what employers can do, I think there's just a lot, right? Because we have such a diverse community, and not all of us can benefit from the same interventions. So for me, it could be larger screens at work, or bigger screens, or working with things digitally rather than on paper, right? Where I can blow up the PDF as large as I could possibly want it and scroll back and forth. And, people who come into my office just think that's nuts, but of course that's how I have to do it. And I've learned how to deal with it that way. I think being available, an employer being available and open as to listening to their employees in terms of what they may need is kind of the basics, right? In terms of fulfilling the needs of a disabled employee or a disabled associate. So I have to say, just talking about the PDF issue, or talking about the interviewing issue side of things too, think kind of, and this is easy to say, think about what you're saying to your employee, to your disabled employee, to the person who who has perhaps disclosed that they have a disability. And that's easy to say, and it's much harder to do, and I recognize that. And just give you a quick example. I had an interview where I was talking with an older attorney who was very, very, very committed to paper over digital, and she just kind of had this this moment during our interview where she kind of went off on a tangent. She said like, "Oh yeah, I think you can't even review a contract properly if you don't print it out and have it in front of you, and you're looking through the pages and you have a highlighter and a pen, and you're able to go back and forth." And I did at that point kind of, I hope, gently stop the interview and just say like, well, and I recognize that a lot of people have that opinion and a lot of people work best that way. But for those of us with a visual impairment, in fact, it's easier for us to do this online and digitally and do that kind of review digitally. And she was very gracious about it and understood exactly where I was coming from. But those kinds of faux pas are, we all do it. But it's definitely something that employers can think about when they're dealing with their employees. So thank you.
Can I add on to Christopher's point? I love what you said, Christopher, about there's not really like a universal policy or procedure that works for everyone because we're all so differently abled. And so for that reason, I think it's really important to have people who are differently abled at the table when you're making these policies and procedures. And again, not, what works for me might not work for Christopher or Sarah, but at least having somebody with that insight of what it's like to have an invisible disability or a visible disability at the table, I think is really important. I also think that there's a few things that, although they don't work for everyone, they do work for multiple different abilities. One is accessible bathrooms. A lot of people with disabilities benefit from accessible bathrooms. So having a gender neutral private bathroom, I think, is important. Making sure that it has space, because it's not just people with wheelchairs who may need space in a bathroom. So that's something that workplaces can do. Another thing is flexibility. Policies, like, we're lawyers, we love policies and procedures, but also there has to be room for some flexibility, because what works for me is not going to work for Christopher, but might work for Sarah, and vice versa. So I think the policies and procedures are important, but just recognizing that there should be some flexibility, because each person has a different ability. What works for one person won't work for another. Another thing is dress codes. So as lawyers, we dress professionally for court and oftentimes dress professionally for the workplace. I know some people with different abilities, if you're in a wheelchair or neurodivergent, certain dress codes may be difficult. So I think that's another place where employers can be flexible or just open-minded when they're thinking about writing policies and procedures.
And if I can just add one more thing onto that, and second everything that Christopher and Hannah said, and also just touching on flexibility. Not only do we have people need different things, but even people with the same diagnosis, I just want to say, also have very different needs. Like someone asked me the other day, I have I'm supervising someone who has bipolar disorder, like, what should I do? I'm like, ask them. It's great that they were being thoughtful. That's really awesome. But I can't speak for them. And I think employer flexibility is super important.
I love that. Just to jump in real quickly, I think that should be like the watchword. Ask them. Ask them. That's a great place to start, because we do want to be asked, because often we have an idea about what we need, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think flexibility is super important. And as you all mentioned, there's so many different types of disabilities and so many needs. So really providing opportunities for employees to express their needs and receive whatever types of accommodations they need to get their jobs done, and do it in the most kind of respectful, affirmative way possible, is really important. So let's talk about COVID. So with the pandemic, and we all transitioned to these virtual formats. So what have we learned from that experience? And how has the transition to the increased use of virtual formats, especially in the legal profession, how has that kind of changed the profession? How has it helped, especially with lawyers with disabilities?
It's been a huge help. Oh, Christopher, do you want to go?
Oh, no, not at all. Go ahead.
It's been a huge help for me. I think one thing that we learned from the pandemic is that a lot of things that we thought were essential are not actually essential. And so it was really kind of grounding to see, okay, what is essential for me to do my job and what is not essential. So uncontested hearings on Zoom are really convenient for clients with disabilities and attorneys with disabilities, because a virtual hearing means that you don't have to navigate the courtroom. You don't have to go through security at the courthouse with a wheelchair or with other disabilities. Parking is not always accessible at courthouses. So just virtual hearings have made, I think, courtrooms much more accessible for people. Working from home means that people don't have to commute. And for some people, commuting is a really big burden if you have a disability. It also means that on your lunch break, you can do a telehealth appointment in private versus being in your office space where you might share a wall. It also means access to your medical supplies and medication without having to pack them and bring them to work. So I think working from home makes the workplace a lot more accessible. And even if there's some days where you have to be in the office to meet with clients, or you have to be in the office, or you have to be at the courthouse, there are some days where really you can just draft from home, and that makes the work week more accessible.
I just want to say I absolutely agree with everything you said, Anna. I didn't even realize that there was this concern in me, this fear in me about um, being able to get to hearings on time. Frankly, I don't drive. I can't get a license because of my disability, my visual impairment, and so there's always been, I think, in the back of my mind, like, am I going to be able to make it? Am I going to have everything together? Am I going to be able to read like what I printed out? Am I going to be the best that I can be for my client? And with virtual hearings, it's just, the pressure was just gone, and it was wonderful to just not have that nagging, concern in the back of my head. Now, of course, I have other concerns, like which window is open and where are my notes. And just the kind of underlying performance anxiety that a lot of us deal with. But that at least was something that disappeared. And now with some COVID protocols loosening up, people are talking about having in-person hearings again here in New Mexico. And they're excited about it. Generally speaking, a lot of the lawyers are happy to be headed back. And I feel once again like the lone voice saying, "Oh, but wait a minute, there's a lot of people who are going to be left behind, and there's a lot of people who, or maybe 5 people, I don't know, but certainly me, who have concerns about going back into the physical courtroom again." So yeah, I feel that pressure coming back again now.
And to add on to that, and again, I agree with everything that Christopher and Hannah you've said. And to add on to that, I think also, I think it would be great to keep the flexibility of this kind of remote hybrid work environment, also just in the workplace, not just for court. I think a lot of these accommodations, we know people with disabilities had been asking for those before the pandemic. When the pandemic started, I was in law school, and a lot of students had been requesting things like an option to call into class if you can't attend for whatever reason, and also without having to explain exactly why you can't attend and things like that. And I think keeping things like meetings accessible virtually for people who either are at home or, going between medical appointments, or people who maybe don't even have a disability themselves, but are caretakers for someone with a disability, I think can make a big difference in quality of life. And we've learned not necessarily take away from work product or productivity or anything like that. It can actually make things a lot easier overall for everybody.
Thank you. And so now let's just transition a little bit to inclusivity. I think we talked about kind of how functionally to improve the workspace for lawyers with disability. I think Hannah touched on it a little bit earlier about kind of making sure that lawyers with disability have a seat at the table in decision making. But what can we do, not even just from an employer perspective, but a coworker's perspective, for example, to really make sure that people and lawyers with disabilities aren't just accommodated in their workplaces, but actually thrive?
I think that kindness is the bare minimum that people can do. And I think that with kindness, usually I think your question would be answered. And the truth is that you never know when you're going to join the disability community. So it just so happens, well, and actually, Christopher, I don't know if you shared this, but Sarah and I both shared that we're not born with our disability. We were diagnosed later in life. So we joined the disability community. And I think that other people in our profession, you may join the disability community one day, you may have a loved one who does. And so this could apply to you one day, even if it doesn't apply to you right now. And so I think it's important to familiarize yourself with the internal policies that your company has, and then be an ally for your colleagues. So for me personally, I rely on my colleagues as a sounding board, because I feel comfortable talking to my close colleagues about my specific medical condition, and they're familiar with the policies in our workplace, so they can help me brainstorm ways to ask for an accommodation, or how can I be successful in asking for this accommodation? How can I still do what's expected of me with this accommodation? And also just remember that there's no universal disabled experience. So being a good listener for people when they come to you, and like Sarah said, just ask them, what does this specific person need? Because there's really just no universal experience. And so I think being an ally means being a good listener, being flexible, and if necessary, being willing to speak up when you see something that you know is not right.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think also taking steps to kind of educate yourself about some of these issues and challenges that people with disabilities face, and even things that seem small, but that can make a big difference to people around you or to your friends with disabilities, make them feel supported, is just being thoughtful about your language, for example, or the way you're thinking about things, like a person with schizophrenia and not a schizophrenic, or a person who uses a wheelchair and not someone confined to a wheelchair, which are common phrases that have been used for a long time. And I'm sure people who say those things honestly don't mean it in a bad way, but it just kind of reinforces, I think, stigma and feelings of being excluded. And so I think, in addition to everything Hannah said, just being thoughtful about, in and out of the workplace, you don't know who you're around, who might be dealing with some of these issues. Like Hannah said, you might even deal with some of these issues in the future, and to just kind of work on reframing your own perspective on these issues independently.
And I guess I would add patience, because, a lot of us have kind of this internalized desire not to cause other people difficulty, or, not to cause waves, that I've been dealing with my disability, born into the disability community, as it were. My whole life, and that's definitely something I think I've internalized. Like I need to figure it out myself. I need to do it myself, and I want to do it myself, because in many ways I just need to prove that I can, to myself or maybe to the world. But regardless, it can lead to perhaps some I don't know, like situations where I would appreciate patience from my coworkers while I kind of work through whatever I need to work through, and anything that coworkers can do to decrease the number of hoops that we have to jump through in order to get what we need, right? So if you can point us to the right HR person, if you can point us to the right manager, somebody that you trust that maybe we don't know well yet. Those are kinds of things I think that are really helpful.
Actually, can I add one thing to that Christopher just made me think of? So I think that there's some people with disabilities who are really transparent about their experience and are happy to be open about it. And there's some people that have disabilities who don't want to be open about it, and that is okay. That's valid. That's their decision. As somebody who is open about it, I feel a responsibility to my colleagues who maybe aren't as open about it. And so sometimes I'll get an email from someone that says, I know that you have a similar situation. I'm not comfortable raising this, but this is the situation I'm in. Do you have any advice? And I think it's really important for there to be the outspoken people and also the people who aren't, so that way we can serve each other.
I think that's a great point. Like I said, I'm not one of the wave makers per se. So I would very much appreciate to have somebody in my organization that I did trust, that was maybe in a similar boat that I could reach out to. So thanks for that, Hannah.
Thank you all for sharing those thoughts. Now we're gonna allow some time for some attendee questions. So if you have any questions, please, I think you can type them in the Q&A section. If you want to direct those to a specific panelist, you can do that, or just ask a general question. But I'll give everyone about a minute or so to think of any questions.
And Victoria, could I jump in for a second?
Of course.
Great. Well, just while we're waiting for questions, I have this pet theory of mine that I've been kind of working on. I want to share. I think this is a great panel to share with. So, we briefly talked about the diversity of experience that, disabled people have. We haven't really touched on the term disabled yet, whether we like it, whether we don't like it, what's our relationship to it. I know that there's some strong feelings about the term differently abled, that it doesn't really encompass what we hope that it would encompass, that it may be a little too watered down and doesn't really communicate, our experience as disabled people. But then I'm one of the people who don't mind the term disabled. I think it is a pretty good descriptor. But my feeling is that maybe it does one thing really well and one thing very poorly. And the thing that it does really well, of course, is that it explains that things are harder for us. There are certain things that are more difficult for those of us with a disability, hands down, than somebody who's typically abled. But I think the thing that it doesn't do well, right, is that it kind of mutes or it kind of hides the diversity of experience within the disabled community. So I have this pet theory that we should all be exploring different prefixes because there's so many prefixes out there. So maybe the problem is the dis, right? The prefix dis. Perhaps calling everyone disabled doesn't really speak to what your experience is. Perhaps you're post-abled, right? Perhaps you had an issue prior and something happened and you entered the disabled community. And so you're like anti-abled or disabled or post-abled or even pre-abled. Perhaps you're super abled because you are in a wheelchair and you can get around faster than people who have you walking down the street, right? There's just so many different ways to kind of express this diversity. I guess I would maybe just encourage each one of us to look at a list of prefixes and think about this in terms of the diversity of experience. For example, maybe you're not disabled, maybe you feel just a little bit underabled or interabled or misabled or what have you, or maybe even foreabled. So this is my theory of the term disabled, and I would be very curious to hear from the other two panelists what they think.
I like your theory. I think that's really interesting. And as you both know, I'm sure, and Victoria, about the kind of conversation around language, what is appropriate, what's not appropriate. And again, we all have our individual preferences. Like some people don't want to be called disabled. Some people do. I don't necessarily have a strong preference myself, and that's also pretty normal. And I agree that the blanket term, it's obviously not a blanket label. So I will be thinking about that.
I love that theory. I'm going to be thinking about that a lot too. I also don't feel strongly about the term disability or disabled. I try and use people first language because that's what I like is people first language. But I also, if I have a client who didn't use people first language to describe themselves, or maybe they used a word I wouldn't use, like the R word, I try and mirror their language because I realize that just because I want to be described a certain way doesn't mean that other people want to be described a certain way. I love the idea of different prefixes because it's not just this one blanket statement, because I think that disability is just such a broad term. I think it's only recent that I viewed myself as a person with a disability. I really identified as I have a chronic illness. It's an autoimmune disease. And it wasn't until I was in law school and needed accommodations, and then at work I needed accommodations. And those accommodations came from the Americans with Disabilities Act that I kind of put the disability as a part of my identity. So I think, while disability does describe my experience, it doesn't feel like my experience all the time. And so I like the idea of using different words.
And Hannah, if you could, I don't even think I understand. What's person first language? Could you give us a little primer in that?
Yeah, so a person first language would be that you are a person with a situation. So like Sarah was saying, instead of calling somebody a schizophrenic, it's a person with schizophrenia, or a person with serious mental illness, or I'm a person with Crohn's disease, or and it also translates outside of the disability community. So like a person experiencing homelessness is a much kinder way than to say they're a homeless person. So it's identifying the person first and then just using the descriptor to describe them after you've identified them as a person. But again, I like people first language for myself, but not everybody likes talking in people first language. So it's kind of the way that you said about how differently abled and disabled is a conversation right now. I think people first language is a conversation right now too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks so much.
Just thank you all for those thoughts. Thank you, Christopher, for making that suggestion, bringing that topic up. I love it. It's a very, very lawyerly way of talking about disabilities. I would love to see it in writing. And then Hannah, one just final thought from me is when you were talking about mirroring a client's language, one thing that came up for me is that in kind of a world that's not as kind to disabled people, or really as many people as it should be kind to, which is everyone, a lot of people grow up in environments where they don't even know such, person first language exists, where everyone around them refers to them as the R word. So they don't even know that there's kinder language for them. And so I appreciate that you can be there to open them up to kindness, because a lot of people just don't get to experience that at home or in their environments. So thank you for that. And so we'll start with Sarah, and then Hannah, and then Christopher. If you could share any final thoughts that you might have, if you'd like to share with our panelists, share with our audience, how they can get in touch with you if they'd like to, any information like that before we close out for the day.
Still muting myself this far into the pandemic. Oh my gosh, if it's still going on. But I'm happy to share my email in terms of getting in touch with me. And thank you again for having this discussion, having us here. I think, again, we've said it a bunch, but just listen to people about their needs. They know themselves. Try to be supportive, be kind. I think also, again, there's so much stigma, and using your voice to try to break that down, whether it's sharing your experiences or advocating for things like removing character fitness questions from the bar applications about mental illness. I know that specific thing has discouraged some of my friends even from seeking help during law school because they were afraid to disclose. Just things like that. Being thoughtful about where awareness of these issues can fit into your own life, even if you don't have a disability.
I think one last thing I would say is that even though the legal profession is by definition an adversarial one, we're all humans at the end of the day. Your employees, your employer, your opposing counsel, everybody that you work with, clients included, may have a disability. They may know about your experience, they may not know about your experience. And so I think kindness and thoughtfulness go a long way. I also think with disabilities, there tends to be this elephant in the room. If somebody sees your disability or has an idea that you have an invisible disability, it's just, they feel like, okay, I need to ask about it, or I want to know how to accommodate it, but I don't know how to ask. And I would just go back to what Sarah says, is just ask them. There doesn't need to be an elephant in the room. Of course, there's an appropriate way to do things and to ask things. I would definitely say, think before you ask, but I would encourage you to just ask people what they need and to then provide that based with kindness and compassion. And I can put my personal email in the chat. Is the chat visible for people?
Yes, I think if you direct it to, oh, actually, I don't think so. But we can find a way to just make sure it's available to people, or you can say it out
Yeah.
loud.
My personal email address is hannahmkramer@gmail.com. It's HANNAHM as in Morgan, CRAMER@gmail.com. And I'm always happy to provide support or just talk through things related to disability world.
And my email, please feel free to reach out. If any of this has sparked interest, or if you have you want to talk to somebody who's in a similar situation as you, who has been through maybe something that you're going through, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is my first initial last name, CPOMMIER @simonsfirm.com. That's SIMONSFIRM.com. For final thoughts, I guess I just want to refocus on, employers. Really, I guess I would say really just remember to reiterate your commitment, to diversity, to just say, I'm here, just say, when you're at a recruitment event, it always makes me think of pipelining. When you're at a recruitment event, when you're at an event with law students, and with associates, say, our firm is committed to diversity. Our firm has a commitment to it, and this is why. Because of whatever reason, it improves business outcomes. It's just an important thing to do for humanity. But if you put yourself out there as someone committed to diversity, someone who's committed to addressing issues that that disabled people are experiencing, the people of color are experiencing, that goes a long way to creating confidence, trust, a sense of safety, the kinds of things that anyone needs, but maybe in particular that disabled people need to feel as though they're included in the conversation, that that our thoughts and feelings and recommendations are being considered appropriately. So that would definitely be my final thoughts, and I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you all, Christopher, Hannah, Sarah, for those thoughts. Thank you to our attendees, both currently present and those watching in the future, for being with us. This was a great conversation, and I hope that through your work and the work of others, through the ABA YLD's DE&I team, that we can help create better outcomes for all attorneys, especially those with disabilities. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Have a wonderful one.